Good day, friends. Russian tanker sanctions from the EU and the US, the nitty-gritty details. In these three short films, we see the Russian response, the possibility of escalation into a full-blown naval conflict, and what happened to the captured Russian crew.
If they steal our reserves, the best way would be nukes.
That wasn't an idle threat, it was a warning, and it reflects a hardening of attitude inside Russia. Maritime sanctions were meant to block Russia's economic arteries. Instead, they've triggered a series of responses that could diminish Ukraine's position and embarrass Western supporters. Analysts such as Tucker Carlson, Glenn Deason, Emil Kosman, Scott Ritter have all noticed this shift. Since sanctions intensified, Russia's ability to export oil and gas has been disrupted. The Trump administration's imposition of what some are calling the Don Road Doctrine has widened this pressure. A Chinese-owned vessel bound for China was seized. More recently, the tanker Marinero was confiscated and its civilian crew arrested for sanctions violations. Russia's response has been to place armed defenders aboard ships carrying sanctioned products. In some cases, tankers such as Sparta 4 and Miscellanea are now escorted by destroyers or other naval vessels. This marks a shift from evasion to protection. According to Reuters, President Putin stated the most radical way is to cut Ukraine off from the sea. That may once have sounded like rhetoric, but more recently, both Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have reiterated that in the face of continued European intransigence, Russia may see no alternative but to continue its military operation, potentially depriving Ukraine of sea access altogether. What was once theoretical is now openly discussed. In his Tucker Carlson interview, Sergei Karaganov spoke of using nuclear weapons if Russia was losing. But in the Glenn Deason interview, he warned that continued interference with Russia's freedom of the seas could in itself provoke a nuclear response. The essence of his message was clear. Inside Moscow, attitudes harden with every incident of seizure, harassment or perceived piracy. Karaganov notably avoided criticizing the United States, stating that Russia still appreciated President Trump's peace efforts. With Russia's shadow tanker fleet seized, harassed and restricted, where does this go next? We appear to be entering a period of what-ifs. What if a US or European force attempts to board a defended tanker? What if that tanker is carrying air defense systems? What if shots are fired from an escorting destroyer? It's all conjecture for now, but one thing is clear. Russia is signalling this is not over. Picture this. Trump seizes a tanker and its sanction-breaking crew are taken to the US to face the wrath of the home courts, be vilified and punished. Great media, great show of US law and power, eh? Zero tolerance. And you can imagine the reaction in Europe. Ursula von der Leyen nodding approvingly, Kaja Kallas applauding, Keir Starmer reminding us solemnly about the rule-based international order. Naturally, strict enforcement would be widely celebrated, except, according to Reuters, the story didn't quite pan out. The crew was multinational, and crucially, the majority were not Russian. There were 17 Ukrainians, civilian sailors, merchant seamen, working on commercial ships that move cargo around the world. And at that point, enthusiasm for strict legal principle cooled rather noticeably, because prosecuting Ukrainians for breaking sanctions that were publicly justified as helping Ukraine would have looked, well, awkward. According to Reuters, the Ukrainian sailors were released, and once that happened, continuing to prosecute the remaining 2 Russian sailors on the same ship, accused of the same offence, became legally and politically difficult. Reuters and Russian officials confirmed that Russian crew members returned to Russia. Sky News and Maritime Executive covered in detail the captain and senior officer being taken to the United States. but they did not publish where any of the Ukrainian crew chose to go. No destinations, no confirmations, just silence. According to a Telegram post by Ukrainian defense lawyer Tatiana Montian, the sailors were offered destination choices, and none of the Ukrainian crew wished to return to Ukraine. Why might those destinations be politically sensitive? One possibility is conscription. Men of military age returning to Ukraine face mandatory service. Another is identity. Some sailors may hold Ukrainian passports while coming from regions like Donbass. The most uncomfortable possibility of all, that sailors from Kiev-controlled Ukraine who worked on a sanctioned vessel could risk being treated not as civilians doing a job, but as traitors. According to Reuters, 5 crew members were allowed into the United States, despite not being charged, in order to testify, which is notable because giving evidence by video link is now routine. Sanctions remain sacred in theory. In practice, they turn out to be remarkably flexible. And that, according to what was reported and what wasn't, is how this story was managed.
Just taking out the UK and Germany with nuclear weapons.
We should start to punish them, attacking their vessels and their ports.
So, is Sergei Karaginov's warning aimed at British ports and at Keir Starmer? How seriously should it be taken? An imminent Russian strike may not be on the table right now, but this isn't empty rhetoric either. In early December 2025, President Putin publicly raised what he called the most radical option, severing Ukraine's access to the sea, following attacks on Russian oil tankers. Karaginov's remarks point to a hardening attitude in Moscow. Britain now appears emboldened by recent US actions, including the confiscation of the tanker Marinera and others. The question is whether this becomes a path London actually chooses to follow. From Moscow's perspective, seizing Russian tankers isn't enforcement, it's asset confiscation during an undeclared maritime conflict. Of course, there's another possibility, that this is largely political signalling from London. Tough language designed to project resolve and bolster Ukraine, rather than a threat to actually do anything. Britain has talked tough before without following through. In fact, this exact scenario played out not so long ago. In 2019, Britain seized an Iranian tanker in Gibraltar. Iran responded by seizing a UK-flagged vessel. The result? A quiet British climb down and release of the impounded ship. So it would be reasonable to assume that, still nursing burnt fingers, Britain might act more cautiously this year. And this is where the house of cards begins to tumble. London may see proposed tanker seizures as symbolic pressure, a narrative gesture in support of Ukraine, while Moscow interprets them as the opening of a maritime front. Any Russian response may not be immediate. It could wait for seizures to occur, then answer with its own seizures, a tit-for-tat cycle at sea. Or something bigger. And what of legality? If Russian planners conclude the intent is towards sustained seizures, then, as demonstrated by Trump's Greenland decision, legal arguments fly out of the window. Strategic goals are set. At that point, it's no longer about law, it's about the physical. Tankers don't sail forever on the high seas, they always have a destination. And that destination is invariably a port.